The body of James O'Brien was found in one of the quiet neighborhoods of Vancouver, inside an abandoned warehouse. It was late October, 2022. A thick fog enveloped the streets, creating an eerie sense of isolation. The warehouse was located in an area long forgotten by progress and life. No one noticed how a group of men entered. No one saw their faces. No one heard James's cries. He was attacked, each blow like a nail driven into his past. After 3 hours of torment, James was left on the cold concrete floor, abandoned. When the police arrived at the crime scene, they found only his battered body and signs of struggle. The investigation began, but everything moved slowly. The 5 men who left behind only chaos and blood were nowhere to be found. Their identities remained a mystery, and their motives were cloaked in darkness. James's son, Eric O'Brien, was a teenager when he learned of his father's death. He listened to the investigators in silence, showing no emotion. But inside, something dark was growing, something that began to take form. Eric vowed to get justice. 10 years passed. Eric now lived in Toronto, far from the place that brought him so much pain. He worked in a construction company, seemingly living an ordinary life. But in reality, his life was far from peaceful. All of his energy, every thought, was focused on one thing: finding those who took his father's life. He gathered all the materials he could find. He recorded every detail, examined every lead. Through his contacts, he gained access to parts of James's case that were never made public. Eric knew the investigation couldn't go on forever. The police had closed the case years ago, dismissing it as a random act of aggression. But for Eric, it was never random. He felt that it had been planned, that it wasn't just an act of violence, but something more. He started by searching for people his father had known. Someone had to know something. He remembered those who came to their house, those who worked or drank with his father. He recalled friends and enemies, trying to figure out who might have wanted his father dead. One day, after years of searching, Eric came across an old photograph. In it, his father stood with 5 other men whom Eric had never seen before. The photograph was taken at some corporate event. Eric studied the men's faces carefully, trying to identify them. After months of searching on social media and using his contacts, he managed to identify 2 of them. They were former colleagues of his father from a construction company. The other 3 were harder to track, but Eric didn't give up. He started following the 2 men he had found. They were already older, one of them the owner of a small construction firm in Calgary, the other retired, living in a modest house on the outskirts of Edmonton. Eric observed their habits and routines. He knew they were involved. He could feel it in his bones. But he needed more to prove it. He began to secretly infiltrate their lives, figuring out what they had been doing 10 years ago when his father was killed. The turning point came when Eric found out that one of the men, Thomas Lang, regularly attended a small club in Calgary. This club was known for its private gatherings and was only accessible to trusted members. Eric decided to take a risk. He used a fake ID and got into the club, trying to gather more information. One day, while eavesdropping, he heard Thomas mention something about old business, about a past that won't let go. Eric knew he was on the right track. Eric decided it was time to act. He knew he could no longer just wait and observe. He began to develop a plan. It wasn't an easy decision. He understood that once he started, there would be no turning back. He began studying their routes, their daily lives, the weak spots in their routines. Thomas Lang was first on his list. Eric watched him every night, figuring out when he was alone. Finally, the moment came when Eric knew he was ready. It was a cold night in Calgary when Eric decided to act. Thomas was walking home after one of his club meetings. He was passing through a dark, empty lot, with no one around. Eric followed, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. He didn't feel fear, only anger. Anger and pain for the years he had lost, for the father who had been taken from him. Eric approached Thomas from behind, and within seconds, Thomas was on the ground. Eric didn't want just to end his life. He wanted Thomas to know why. Eric leaned down to Thomas, whispering in his ear that he was James O'Brien's son. Thomas looked at him, his eyes wide with terror. Eric saw what he needed in those eyes: recognition, fear, and the realization that there would be a price to pay. Eric left him no chance of escape. Thomas's life ended in the same dark place where he had once committed his own crimes. Eric left the scene as quietly as he had come, leaving the body behind in the shadows of the abandoned lot. Eric knew this was just the beginning. One man was gone, but 4 others were still out there. He felt no remorse. For him, it was justice. He returned to Toronto as if nothing had happened. He continued working, chatting with colleagues, living his ordinary life. But inside, something had changed. He felt that by ending Thomas's life, he had taken the first step toward finishing what had begun 10 years earlier. Eric started working on his next target. He knew that the police might connect Thomas's death to something larger, but it didn't scare him. He was ready for whatever might come. The next person on his list lived in Edmonton. Eric began planning his trip there, preparing everything necessary for his next move. His mission had only just begun, and nothing could stop him. The past came alive in his memory once more. He remembered his father, his smile, his laughter. Eric knew he could never bring him back, but he could bring justice. He vowed not to stop until he found all 5 men. The path of revenge was dark and dangerous, but for Eric, it was the only path that made sense. He understood that he might lose everything, but it didn't scare him. He had already lost the most important things: his family, his future, his hope. Edmonton Eric arrived in Edmonton at the end of February. The cold wind and frozen streets of the city perfectly matched his mood. Cold and empty. In this city lived his next target, Richard Harper. Eric already knew a lot about his life. He tracked him through social media, watched Richard's house, and even once followed him from home to the market. Eric gathered information like a spider weaving a web, slowly, patiently, waiting for the victim to end up in the center. Richard Harper, an ordinary-looking retiree, lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Edmonton. Eric watched him for a long time, studying his habits and daily routine. Every morning, Richard went for a walk in the nearby park, then went shopping, and in the evenings, he often sat by the window, lost in his thoughts. It seemed like he had long left behind all his dark deeds, but Eric knew the truth. He saw in this man one of the faces of the group that had taken his father's life. Eric decided that the best time to act would be late in the evening when Richard returned home from the store. He waited for weeks, watching every step Richard took, planning the perfect moment for an attack. Eric knew that he needed to act quickly and confidently, leaving no trace. At some point, he felt like a hunter tracking his prey. With each passing day, his determination grew, and along with it, the tension, as if his heart beat in sync with the ticking of time. One cold March night, Eric finally made his move. He waited until Richard finished his shopping and headed home. Eric followed him, staying at a distance, hiding in the shadows. Richard had no idea he was being followed. When they reached a quiet alley, Eric picked up his pace, approaching his target from behind. He grabbed Richard by the collar of his coat and pulled him aside into a dark corner where no one could see them. Richard tried to resist, but age had taken its toll. He was weak while Eric was young and full of anger. Eric pinned him against the wall, and in that moment, there wasn't a trace of mercy in his eyes. He remembered what he had read about Richard in the case files, his participation in the torment, his cruelty, his indifference to the suffering of others. All of it gave Eric strength. He knew he was looking at one of the people who had shattered his life. Eric wasn't in a hurry to end Richard's life. He wanted Richard to realize why he was going to pay for his actions. Eric spoke quietly, but each word hit the target, causing Richard to panic and tremble with fear. He saw Richard's eyes fill with terror, and it filled Eric with a sense of justice. When Richard tried to beg for mercy, Eric only shook his head. There was no mercy, no forgiveness. He knew he was doing the right thing. After a few minutes of struggle, Richard Harper lay lifeless on the ground. Eric watched him for a few moments, as if making sure he was truly gone, and then walked away from the body. He knew that now the police would be looking for a connection between Richard's death and Thomas's, but it didn't scare him. He had already prepared an alibi, and he was ready for anything. The main thing was that his mission continued, and he was one step closer to his goal. Eric understood that with each incident, the pressure on him would grow, but he couldn't stop. He returned to Toronto, but the thoughts of his next target kept haunting him. He knew that next on his list was Michael, the third man from the photo with his father. Michael was different. He didn't hide in quiet corners of the city. He lived openly, and that made him a more difficult target. Eric knew it would take more preparation, more caution, but it didn't deter him. His path to justice had only just begun. Eric returned to Toronto as if nothing had happened. He continued working, meeting friends, smiling at his neighbors. But every night, he sat at his desk and opened his notes. He carefully studied every detail of Michael's life. This man lived in downtown Toronto, had a family, a job, and friends. But that didn't scare Eric. He knew that sooner or later, he would find a way to get to him. He had already started planning how to infiltrate Michael's life, how to watch him until he found a weak spot. Meanwhile, the police started connecting the dots. 2 deaths, 2 former colleagues of James O'Brien. Investigators couldn't ignore the connection, but there wasn't enough evidence. Eric acted cautiously, leaving no traces, and every move he made was calculated to the smallest detail. He knew he couldn't afford to make mistakes. He understood that if he got caught, he wouldn't be able to finish what he started. And for him, that was unacceptable. He remembered the years when he was a teenager, the day his life fell apart because of his father's death. The memories of that day, when he was told the news, still haunted him, each detail just as vivid as it had been 10 years ago. He remembered his mother's eyes, her tears, her despair. Eric had vowed not to let those responsible go unpunished. He knew he had to finish what he started to bring some semblance of justice to his family. Eric kept following Michael. He found out that Michael worked for a large company, held a high position, and was well respected among his colleagues. He also learned that Michael visited the same cafe every morning before work. Eric began going to the cafe too, sitting in a corner, watching his target. He saw how Michael interacted with the barista, how he talked on the phone, how he laughed. And every time Eric saw that smile, rage built up inside him. This man, living his life as if nothing had happened, was one of those who had taken his father away. Eric knew that confronting Michael would be more challenging. It required thorough preparation, more time, and more resources. But he wasn't in a hurry. He knew he had to be patient, that every mistake could cost him everything. He watched Michael not only in the cafe but also at work and near his home. He found out when Michael was alone, when he came home later than usual, and when his family went away for the weekend. Eric wrote everything down, planning when and how he could make his move. Eric knew his path was dangerous, that every night spent watching, every action increased the risk, but he also knew he couldn't stop. He had already taken 2 lives, and there was no turning back. He vowed to see it through to the end, and nothing could stop him. He was ready to go all the way, even if it meant losing his own life. Because for Eric, it was more than just revenge. It was his mission, his duty to his father. Several weeks passed before Eric found the right moment. He knew that Michael would be home alone the following weekend, when his family was leaving for a few days. This was his chance. Eric began to prepare, checking everything down to the smallest detail. He knew he would have little time, that he would need to act quickly and precisely. No mistakes, no wasted movements. He was ready. Eric knew that dealing with Michael would require a different approach. Unlike his previous targets, Michael wasn't an old man living alone on the outskirts. He was an influential and respected figure, with a family and friends making the task much more complex. But that didn't deter Eric. He knew that he had to eliminate everyone involved in the crime against his father, and Michael was next on his list. Eric began his plan by observing Michael and his family. He wanted to know everything about his life, when he left for work, when he came back, where he liked to spend his time. It took several weeks, but Eric was patient. He followed Michael every morning when he went to the office, then again in the evenings when he returned home. Eric found out that Michael often stayed late at work and sometimes met with colleagues in bars or cafes, which gave him his first lead. One day, Eric found out that Michael would be staying home alone for the weekend. His wife and kids were visiting relatives. This was the perfect moment to act. Eric began preparing. He checked all the details. When Michael's family would leave, when they would return, how to approach the house unnoticed. He crafted a plan that left no room for error. On Saturday evening, when night had fallen, Eric set out for Michael's house. He dressed in dark clothing to stay hidden in the night. The streets were empty, and Eric, moving cautiously, approached Michael's house. He knew he had limited time, just a few hours while Michael was alone, and no one was expecting him back. Eric made his way through the backyard, climbed over a low fence, and approached a window. He already knew that the house's alarm system was only installed on the doors, and the windows were unguarded. He slowly opened one of the windows that was slightly ajar for ventilation and slipped inside. Michael was in the kitchen, drinking wine, seemingly lost in thought. Eric watched him from the shadows, preparing for the decisive moment. Eric approached Michael, knowing that he wasn't expecting an attack. He struck him from behind, knocking him to the floor. Michael tried to fight back, but Eric was faster and stronger. He pinned Michael to the ground and began to speak. Words burst out of Eric with the fury that had built up over the years. He wanted Michael to know who was in front of him, who was about to take his life. He told him about his father, about what he saw and felt during the days when his life fell apart. Michael tried to justify himself, saying it was a long time ago, that he hadn't wanted any of it, but Eric wasn't interested. For him, there were no excuses, no forgiveness. He wanted Michael to understand that there was a price for every action. Eric saw the fear in Michael's eyes, saw him realize his inevitable fate, and it gave Eric a sense of justice. Slowly but steadily, Eric did what he had come to do. He ended Michael's life, leaving him lying on the kitchen floor among broken glasses and spilled wine. Eric felt no remorse. He left no traces that could point to his presence. He knew that sooner or later the police would find the body, and they might realize it was the work of the same person. But for Eric, it didn't matter. He knew that next on his list was his last and most important target. Eric returned home as if nothing had happened. He knew that the police would intensify their search, that they would be looking for a suspect. But Eric was already a step ahead. He continued his normal life, working and meeting friends, ensuring no one suspected him. But each night, he replayed his next move in his mind. There was one person left, the one who, he believed, was the mastermind behind his father's death. This person was different. His name was Robert Miller, and he was an influential businessman, someone used to getting what he wanted. He had never lived in the shadows. He was always in the public eye, which made him an even more challenging target. Eric knew that this time he would need not only stealth and precision, but also support. He began looking for ways to enter Robert's world, to become part of his circle. Eric knew that to achieve his goal, he needed to earn Robert's trust. He started visiting places Robert frequented, exclusive clubs, elite events. Eric used forged documents to infiltrate one such event where he could observe Robert in person. He watched how Robert interacted with influential people, how he laughed and seemed to enjoy life. Each minute of witnessing that only strengthened Eric's determination. After several weeks, Eric realized he needed more to get closer to Robert. He began looking for people who could be useful, those who worked for Robert or were connected to his business. Soon, he found a lead, a driver who worked for Robert's company. Eric managed to strike up a relationship with him by using a fake story about looking for a job and offering money for help. The driver turned out to be talkative and willing, for a small fee, to share information about his boss. Eric learned a lot about Robert's daily routine, his habits, and his routes. He found out when and where Robert traveled, who accompanied him, and where he spent his free time. This information was crucial. Eric began developing a plan to approach Robert. He understood that he needed to act quickly, as any mistake could cost him everything. After several weeks of preparation, the moment Eric had been waiting for finally arrived. Robert was going to one of his country villas, a place where he spent time alone, away from the hustle of the city. It was the perfect opportunity. Eric knew that security at the villa would be minimal and that Robert wouldn't expect any trouble. Eric prepared everything he needed for the trip and set off after his target. When Robert arrived at the villa, Eric was already nearby. He watched as Robert got out of the car and entered the house. Eric knew this was his last chance, that if he failed now, he wouldn't be able to finish his mission. He waited until nightfall when the guards relaxed their vigilance, and then he made his move. Eric entered the house, moving quietly like a shadow, knowing he couldn't afford any mistakes. Eric found Robert in his office, sitting and reviewing some documents. Eric approached from behind, and when Robert turned around, he saw the face of a stranger, but the eyes were filled with hatred. Eric began to speak, and his words were full of pain and anger. He told Robert about his father, about what had happened 10 years ago. He saw Robert's face change, saw the realization in his eyes that his past had caught up with him. Robert tried to resist, but Eric was ready for anything. He knew this man deserved to pay more than anyone else. He was the mastermind, the one who gave the orders, the one who decided that James O'Brien's life meant nothing. Eric gave him no chance to escape. He did what he had come to do, and when it was all over, he felt a sense of relief. Eric left the villa, leaving Robert where he deserved to be, lifeless and forgotten. He knew his mission was complete. He had brought justice for his father, for the pain he had endured. Eric understood that the police would start looking for him, that they might figure out who was behind all these incidents. But he no longer cared. He had done what he needed to do, and now he was ready for whatever consequences awaited him. After the crime involving Robert Miller, Eric felt his mission was finally complete. It had been over 10 years since his father was brutally taken from him, and all that time, the desire for justice was the only thing that kept Eric afloat. He felt that by avenging all 5 men, he had restored at least a part of the justice missing in this world. However, instead of satisfaction, Eric felt an unsettling emptiness. The goal that had driven him for so long was achieved, and now he had to live in a world where that goal no longer existed. Returning to Toronto, Eric began to realize that his actions had left a mark not only on those he had taken down, but also on himself. He was no longer the teenager who lost his father 10 years ago. His heart had hardened, and his mind had turned into an endless analysis of threats and possibilities. He stopped feeling joy, becoming wary and suspicious. Every step he took was calculated, every glance analyzed through a lens of threat. Eric understood that his quest for justice had changed him forever, and now he could no longer return to his former life. A few days after returning to Toronto, Eric found out that the police had launched a massive investigation. All the incidents had been linked into a single case. Investigators finally began to understand that all these deaths were not random, that they were connected. The police used every available resource to find the responsible party, and Eric knew his time was running out. His alibi, his caution, all of it worked only until the police focused their attention on one person. Eric decided he needed to disappear. He began preparing to escape, gathering money, preparing forged documents, and planning where to go. He knew Canada would no longer be a safe place for him, that sooner or later the police would find him. He decided to head to South America, to one of those countries where he could blend in among thousands of other runaways, where no one would find him. However, Eric understood that even if he managed to hide, it wouldn't free him from the burden inside. On the night before his departure, Eric went to his father's grave. He hadn't been there in years, and now that it was all over, he felt he needed to say goodbye. He stood in front of the headstone, feeling the cold wind whip across his face, and tried to find the right words. He wanted to tell his father that he had done everything he promised, that those responsible had paid for their actions. But instead, Eric felt only emptiness. He didn't feel pride in his actions, no sense of fulfillment, just a deep emptiness and the realization that his quest for justice had brought him no peace. Eric left the cemetery in complete silence. He knew a long road awaited him, that his life would now turn into a constant escape. He got into his car and headed to the airport, where his flight to a new life was waiting. But as he drove through the night streets of Toronto, Eric suddenly realized he couldn't leave. Something in this city held him. Something wouldn't let him just abandon everything and run. Perhaps it was the memories, or perhaps the few fragments left from his old life. Eric returned to his apartment, knowing he could no longer run. He decided to face whatever awaited him, head on. He knew that sooner or later the police would find him, that they would arrest him, and perhaps he would spend the rest of his life in prison. But now that his mission was complete, Eric saw no point in running. He no longer wanted to hide, no longer wanted to live in constant fear of being caught. He made the decision to stay and face the consequences of his actions. A few days later, there was a knock at his apartment door. Eric knew it was the police. He opened the door to see several officers standing there. They said nothing, just presented him with an arrest warrant. Eric didn't resist. He allowed them to put him in handcuffs and take him away. As they led him down the stairs, he looked at the city through the window, at its lights, at the passers-by, at the cars rushing past. Eric knew he would never see this city the way he once knew it. During interrogations, Eric remained silent. The investigators tried to get a confession, tried to understand his motives, but Eric wouldn't speak. He knew their questions were pointless. He had done what he believed was right, and no words could change that. Eric knew a trial awaited him and that he would be judged. He understood he had no chance of acquittal, that his actions were crimes, and that society wouldn't accept his justifications. When the day of the trial came, the courtroom was filled with reporters and onlookers. The case had drawn a lot of attention, and everyone wanted to see the man who had lived for 10 years with one purpose: to avenge his father's death. Eric stood before the judge, listening to the charges, listening to the witnesses' testimonies. But it all seemed distant and meaningless to him. He knew his fate was already sealed, and that he could no longer live as before. But Eric also knew that he had done what needed to be done. He had avenged his father, and now he was ready to accept any punishment. The court sentenced Eric to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He listened to the sentence without emotion. For him, it was the end of a long journey, a path he had chosen as a teenager when he learned of his father's death. Eric knew he would never see freedom again, but he also knew he had kept his promise. He had avenged his father, and for him, that was the only thing that mattered. Eric spent his first days in prison in solitary confinement. He thought a lot about what he had done, about what had brought him to this point. He remembered his childhood, his family, the happy days that now seemed like part of another life. He knew he could never get them back, that his path had been filled with darkness and pain, but he also knew he couldn't have acted differently. Justice had become his purpose in life, and now that it was complete, all that remained was to accept his fate. Time passed, and Eric gradually grew accustomed to life in prison. He found a peculiar sense of calm in the routine, in the absence of the need to hide and run. He was no longer a hunter, no longer seeking vengeance. Now he was just an inmate, a man who had lost everything but perhaps found some semblance of peace. Eric understood that his actions had been harsh, that they hadn't brought the relief he had hoped for. But he also understood that it was his choice, and he was ready to accept the consequences. Months went by, and Eric began to find meaning in small things, in the books he read, in the rare conversations with other inmates, in the letters he wrote, but never sent. He knew his life would never be what he wanted it to be, but he also knew he had done what he believed was necessary. And now, despite the prison walls around him, he felt freer than he had in the last 10 years. This freedom was not physical, but internal. Eric knew he was no longer bound by the past, that he had kept his promise and could now leave it all behind. He knew his father would have been proud of him, despite the cost of this justice. Eric knew life hadn't given him a second chance, but he had still found his place in this world, even if that place was behind bars. And in that silence, in that solitude, he finally found the peace he had sought for so long.